Hey guys, this is Ms. Holland, and here is our mini lecture on photosynthesis. Now before we actually start talking about photosynthesis, I want to go back to our lab we did on the floating disk lab. Now there are a couple of things that we did in that lab that I want to reiterate before we begin our little lecture. In the lab we had baking soda, which is a sodium bicarbonate that we mixed with some water. And then we also had light, which was in the form of a projector. We also used some spinach, which you guys cut little tiny holes inside of it. Remember using the actual little hole punchers that we cut those holes into. And what we were looking for is this guy right here. This is your actual chloroplast. And inside that chloroplast, which we'll talk about a little bit later, are these little tiny pigments that are known as chlorophyll. Now, long story short, we actually took the sodium, which represented the CO2, we added water here, and we added our light here into a formula, and when the leaves started to float, that meant that they were actually releasing oxygen, which means that they're going through this process called photosynthesis. If we were to actually test the water, we would actually be able to find a little bit of sugar in the water or possibly in the leaves themselves. So here's just a really quick picture of what you guys did. Again, you guys used the light. We had sodium and the water mixed together. The leaves were essentially on the ground at first, and then once they actually started to rise, that meant that we were actually releasing oxygen into the atmosphere, which means that we actually were doing or watching the process called photosynthesis. So now let's talk about photosynthesis. In our floating disk lab, we had a couple things that we were talking about. So light represented the sun here. Water represented H2O. So water is water. So here's our major factors. Baking soda, which is our bicarbonate, actually helped to represent our CO2. And then of course our spinach, which is a plant. What does he represent? Well, he represents having the actual product to do the photosynthesis, which is our chloroplast. So this is our organelle that's going to be responsible for it all. So if we were then to take all of these factors and put them into a formula, we would notice that the sun here, okay, the water here, CO2 here. And so these are all the elements that we need to actually make photosynthesis happen. In order for the leaves to float, we got the oxygen. That was our bubbles that we would actually see if we were to actually look at it microscopically, and the bubbles in turn were actually inside the cell, which in turn made our little leaf float up. And then therefore we also got sugar. So the formula for photosynthesis is as such. If you were to take glucose, which is C6H12O6, and notice he has 6's in him twice, you then take the number 6 and put it in front of every single molecule you see, or compound. That in turn is your formula. So photosynthesis, which I need for you all to remember, is sun, which is your light, plus 6 molecules of water, plus 6 molecules of CO2 is going to yield or produce 6 molecules of oxygen, and then simply 1 molecule of your C6H12O6. Now let's talk about the actual chloroplast himself. So here's our little chloroplast. Inside of our chloroplast, you have these circles that are known as thylakoids. So please make sure that you know how to draw this out, let alone know how to label everything. So let's go ahead and pull this guy out. This guy is known as a thylakoid. He is going to be responsible for attracting our sunlight. Over here, this empty spots inside of our chloroplast is known as your stroma. This entire big guy, in turn, is your chloroplast. And then these stacks of thylakoid, all of them together, are known as grana. Okay. So if we were to take our thylakoid out and actually check this guy out, what he actually does, again, this is a very brief synopsis of photosynthesis. Let's move this over just slightly. Here is our thylakoid, And again, he is a cell membrane, so you have your little heads and tails embedded with a bunch of different proteins. So here's your little heads and tails, some proteins along the way. And on top of these proteins, if I were to kind of look at this a little bit bigger, it kind of looks like this. You have embedded in him these little dots. I don't know if you guys can see that. But these little dots here are your actual pigments. Let's do it this way. So here's your little dots, okay, that are on top of these proteins here. And so this here would be your chlorophyll, A, and this one over here is actually chlorophyll B. So we'll say chlorophyll A and B. The essential elements that you need in order to go in, remember, was sunlight. So here's our light. We're also going to need water, H2O, to go inside. And then we're going to need some CO2. So let's go ahead and put this inside of a cell. So here's the actual chloroplast here, again, which is this big guy over here. And let's go ahead and talk about our process. So water and then sunlight is going to come inside. And then what we're going to pump out into this little area over here, which is known as the stroma, is your ATP and then NADPH. NADPH is what's known as an electron carrier, and ATP from our last lecture is your energy storage. Now, CO2 comes from the outside, so does water. Obviously, the sun's from the outside. And this is going to actually rip apart, the CO2 is going to rip apart the ATP, the NADPH, and it will actually produce out of it this large molecule that's known as glucose. This process of the CO2 and the ATP and NADPH is what's known as the Calvin cycle. And we'll get into that a little bit more specifically next time. Now the water is going to come in and get ripped apart by the sunlight, and it's going to pump out of the chloroplast as well your oxygen, your O2, which in turn is good because that's actually what we use to breathe. So photosynthesis, long story short, creates our food source as well as our oxygen, which is part of our air that we breathe. Now, before we get into what happens to the glucose, let's talk about this guy here, chlorophyll. Now, chlorophyll is actually a type of pigment. So let's break this guy back up. And so pigments, here, there are many different kinds of them. Pigments literally will gather specific wavelengths of light spectrums. And so remember from middle school, the Roy G. Biv, right? Red, orange, yellow, green, indigo, violet. Well, chlorophyll, specifically chlorophyll A and B, will gather the green, will gather all of the red, orange, yellow, blue, indigo, violet colors, but it doesn't like the green. And so this is actually what is reflected, and therefore this is actually what we see. So the illusion that plants are green is just so. We see what they don't want. And so hence, because our eyes work off of light, we see what is being reflected and actually what not the true color of leaves are. So it's kind of interesting. Now there are other pigments that we actually did a lab on the other day, which is our chromatography lab. And when the seasons change and there's not enough sunlight, so when it becomes winter, the sunlight is not as strong because the planet is really farther away. This is why it gets colder. And so because the wavelengths are a little bit shorter, we're going to be using what's known as accessory pigments, such as carotenes, which will actually turn orange, or maybe your xanthophylls, which will turn like your reds and your yellows, okay? And so this in turn is why during the winter, leaves will actually change colors instead of being nice bright green, because we're reflecting the chlorophyll